The text was never meant for her. Sitting at the head of the long walnut conference table, Julian West ran a hand through his dark hair, the salt at his temples giving away his 42 years. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York's skyline glittered cold and sharp. Inside West Holdings, the air was just as crisp, cut by sharp decisions, quarterly earnings, and the clipped heels of assistants who never made eye contact unless invited. Julian rarely made mistakes. He was methodical, focused. He'd built his company from a few borrowed dollars and a stubborn belief in his own ideas. But in the whirlwind of balancing board meetings, investor calls, and custody weekends with his 8-year-old daughter, he'd forgotten to double-check the contact name. The text was simple, blunt. "I don't know what I'm doing. She cried this morning and I froze. I shouldn't have custody if I can't even help my own kid." He'd meant to send it to his assistant, Cam, who had quietly become his sounding board for all things non-business. But the name just above Cam in his contacts, Claire Reading Tutor, had been selected instead. By the time he noticed, the message had been read. Then came the reply. "Maybe you don't have to know everything. Maybe it's enough that you were there." Julian blinked, confused for a moment. Claire, his daughter Grace's reading tutor. She was kind, soft-spoken, and good with kids in a way that seemed to come from another planet entirely. They'd exchanged barely more than polite greetings, and she always looked slightly startled in his presence, like she hadn't meant to be caught in his orbit. He didn't know she texted like that, gently, like she'd placed her hand over his, steadying. He typed back a hasty apology. "That message wasn't for you. Sorry for the overshare." Another reply came, slower this time. "It's okay, I'm glad you did." He should have left it, closed the phone, refocused on the quarterly forecast in front of him. But instead, he found himself staring at her words. There was something in them, something patient, something he didn't know he needed until that moment. Julian hadn't expected fatherhood to be so lonely. When Grace was born, he and Miranda were already living separate lives, hers filled with gallery openings and red-eye flights, his with endless hours in the boardroom. Their divorce had been a quiet war, elegant, almost bloodless, each of them too proud to fight for things they didn't fully understand. At the time, he thought joint custody would be simple. 1 week on, 1 week off. Schedules, routines, easy. But nothing about Grace was simple. She had her mother's stubbornness and his silence, and lately she'd been pulling away. "I'm fine," she'd said that morning when he asked why she was crying at the breakfast table. "I just want Mom." He hadn't had an answer for that. He just watched her poke at her cereal until it turned to mush, his coffee growing cold. Claire Hart was not the kind of woman who got texts from CEOs, let alone a CEO like Julian West. When she saw the message, she'd been in her tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, nursing a cup of tea after a long day of tutoring sessions. She'd stared at the words, her first instinct to delete it, pretend she hadn't seen it. But she hadn't. She remembered the way Grace had looked last Thursday, quiet and distant, not the bright, curious girl Claire had first met. And she remembered something else, how Julian had lingered just a moment too long by the door during pickup, like he didn't want to leave but didn't know how to stay. She shouldn't have replied. But something about the way he'd written that message, unfiltered, human, had cut straight through her reserve. And now he'd texted again. "I just don't know what she needs from me." The words came 10 minutes later, unprompted. Claire hesitated, then typed. "She needs you to stop trying to be perfect. Kids don't want perfect. They want someone who sees them, even when they're hard to look at." There was a long pause. She wondered if she'd overstepped. Then her phone buzzed. "I've never had someone talk to me like that." She smiled a little, sipping her tea, her heart racing just a touch. She could already see it. This wasn't about tutoring anymore. Over the next few days, the texts didn't stop. Sometimes they were about Grace, sometimes they were. Julian would message in the late hours, when the office was empty and the city outside his window stopped pretending to be beautiful and just felt cold. Claire would reply during her breaks, walking between tutoring gigs in her worn coat, fingers chilled but still quick on the keyboard. He told her about Grace's nightmares, about the way she clung to routines, how he kept screwing them up. Claire told him about her childhood in upstate New York, the silence of snow-covered towns and the mother who always hummed while folding laundry. They never spoke about anything they couldn't delete, but in between the lines something was forming, not quite a friendship, not quite anything. When he saw her at their next tutoring session, Julian didn't know what to say. She smiled at him like nothing had changed, and maybe that was what made it harder. Grace curled up on the couch with a book, distracted and withdrawn. Claire sat beside her, patient and steady, asking gentle questions until the little girl softened. Julian watched from the hallway, arms crossed, feeling like an outsider in his own home. That night he texted her again. "You're good with her, better than I am. She doesn't need better, she needs you." He read her message twice. 3 times he didn't reply. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The texts didn't stop, neither did the tutoring, but Julian started finding excuses to linger. He came home earlier. He'd sit in the kitchen while Claire worked with Grace, making noise with the espresso machine he never used, just to have something to do. One afternoon, after Grace had fallen asleep on the rug with a book open on her chest, Julian walked Claire to the door. She adjusted her scarf, her fingers pale in the winter light. "I can't thank you enough," he said, "for what you've been doing." She looked up at him. "You don't have to thank me. Grace is easy to care about." He hesitated. "So are you." The words hung there, neither of them moved. Then Claire smiled, small, unsure, and stepped outside into the falling snow. Julian watched her go, the cold air rushing in behind her, sharp and real. He wasn't sure what this was, but he was starting to realize he didn't want it to stop. Claire didn't mention the moment at the door, not the way he'd looked at her, quietly, like he wasn't used to wanting something and not knowing how to ask for it. She kept showing up twice a week, punctual as ever, her scarf pulled high and cheeks wind-kissed. Grace seemed lighter around her now, a little more talkative, her shoulders less hunched. They played word games, practiced reading aloud, sometimes just colored side by side with no pressure to speak. It wasn't academic anymore. It was something softer, something that gave the little girl room to breathe. Julian noticed every change. He noticed how Grace no longer flinched at questions, how she waited for Claire at the window 10 minutes before each session, how her drawings, once lonely little stick figures in gray, started to include color, a red scarf, a blue coat, a tall figure with dark hair and coffee in his hand. He wondered if that one was him. At work, Julian found himself distracted, meetings blurred, his patience thinned with investors, and his calendar, once sacred, started to shift. He canceled dinner with a tech founder to make it home in time for Grace's bedtime. He postponed a speaking event in San Francisco. He stayed off his phone at home. It wasn't a grand transformation, not yet, but his team noticed. Cam, his assistant, raised an eyebrow when Julian suggested pushing a product launch to give his team a break. "You okay?" Cam asked one afternoon. "You're different." Julian paused. "I think I'm trying to be." On a rare sunny Saturday in early March, Julian found himself standing awkwardly at the edge of a playground, coffee in one hand, his phone in the other. Grace was climbing a rope ladder with the fierce determination of someone much older. She didn't notice him watching. Claire had recommended the park, quiet, tucked into a residential pocket of Brooklyn. He hadn't even known places like this existed. It felt like stepping into another life, one where no one cared who he was, where no one expected him to have all the answers. She showed up 10 minutes later, hair in a loose braid, dressed in jeans and a worn green jacket. Grace ran to her immediately, tugging her toward the swing set without even saying hello. Julian couldn't stop watching her. She joined them after a while, breathless and laughing, cheeks flushed. "She made me promise to push her to the sky," Claire said, sliding onto the bench beside him. He handed her the second coffee he'd picked up. She blinked, surprised, then smiled. "You remembered." "I did." They sat in silence, the easy kind that only comes when both people are thinking the same thing but not ready to say it. Grace's laughter rang through the air. It sounded like something he hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm trying," Julian said after a while, voice low. "With her, with all of it." I know, Claire glanced at him. She feels it, even if she can't say it yet. He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands. Sometimes I think she's better off without me. With Miranda, it's always smiles and pretty weekends and no rules. And with me, it's structure, silence, I'm not fun. Claire's voice was soft. You're safe. He looked at her then, really looked. Something shifted between them, not sharp or sudden, just an awareness settling like dust in a sunbeam. Later, as they were packing up, Grace slipped her hand into Claire's without thinking. Julian saw it, and something ached in him. That night after Grace had gone to bed, Julian sent a message. I want to see you, outside of this, dinner maybe. The reply didn't come right away. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen, regretting it. It was too soon, too messy. She was his daughter's tutor. Then came the buzz. Okay, but only if it's not somewhere with cloth napkins. He laughed quietly, the sound foreign in his own mouth. They met at a small Thai place near Claire's neighborhood. No pretense, no paparazzi, no investor lurking behind a cocktail menu. Julian wore jeans. It felt unnatural at first, like trying on someone else's life, but Claire didn't even blink. She wore a soft sweater the color of storm clouds and tucked one leg beneath her in the booth like she belonged there. Dinner wasn't about deep revelations. It was messy and human. He told her how he hated Sundays because it reminded him of growing up in a silent house with a father who never asked how he was. She told him about her college years, waitressing through exams and wondering if she'd ever have enough to just stop worrying. He asked why she became a reading tutor. Because it matters, she said. When someone looks at a word and doesn't feel stupid for not knowing it, when a kid realizes they're not broken. He nodded. I feel like I've been broken for years. I just got really good at hiding it in a tailored suit. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly, you don't hide it with Grace. You try, but she sees you. That night, as they stood outside the restaurant, cold air threading between them, Julian reached for her hand. Claire didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. It wasn't a declaration, just something new, a question between them. Days passed, then weeks. Claire kept tutoring Grace, but everything under it had shifted. Julian was gentler with his daughter now, more present. He started listening, really listening, when she talked about books, about her dreams, about missing her mom but being okay with that. One night after Claire had left, Grace asked a question. Is she your friend? Julian blinked. Who? Claire, you smile when she's here. He paused. I guess she is. Grace nodded like this was something she'd known long before he had. Then, in her small voice, she makes me feel not scared. Julian couldn't speak, just pulled his daughter into his arms and held her longer than she expected. That night he sent Claire a message. You make her feel not scared, that's everything. Her reply came quickly. She makes me feel brave. He stared at the words. This wasn't what he'd planned. But maybe plans were overrated. Maybe what mattered wasn't perfection, or image, or doing everything right. Maybe it was just this. Two broken people finding something worth holding on to, in the quiet space between mistakes and second chances. Julian stood at the edge of the bookstore aisle, watching Claire read aloud to a group of children nestled into beanbags and mismatched cushions. Her voice carried softly, lilting with every sentence, drawing them in like she was spinning a spell. Grace sat closest to her, knees pulled to her chest, mouth slightly open. She didn't even notice her father in the doorway. He wasn't supposed to be here. Claire had mentioned the weekend reading event during one of their walks, not expecting him to show. But he had canceled a business brunch, turned off his phone, and taken the subway for the first time in years. He didn't fully know why he was here, only that lately his life had started to orbit around the sound of Claire's voice, the shape of her smile when she didn't know he was looking. She wasn't his. There had been no lines drawn, no labels, but still, when he watched her like this, warm and open and glowing with quiet purpose, he felt the ache of wanting more. She caught his eye as the story ended, just a flicker. Her smile shifted slightly, not surprise, something gentler, as if part of her had expected him to come all along. After the children scattered and the bookstore returned to its usual hum, Claire found him near the cookbooks. "You came," she said. "You were incredible." He meant it more than she probably realized. She tilted her head. "You really don't need to keep surprising me." "I'm not doing it for you," he said, and then softer, "Okay, maybe I am, a little." Claire laughed, but there was something wary beneath it. "Julian," she said carefully, "you know this, whatever this is, it's not simple." "I know. I'm Grace's tutor, that line matters." He stepped closer just enough. "Then we stop tutoring, we find her someone else, or you stay and we're honest about it. Either way, I'm not pretending this isn't happening." She looked at him long enough that he felt stripped bare. And then finally, "Okay, but slowly." He nodded. Slowly is good. The first time she came over just to see him, Grace noticed right away. Claire had arrived on a Sunday afternoon with no tote bag of books, no lesson plan, just her. She sat in the kitchen with Julian while Grace played on the floor nearby, building a city from blocks and old cereal boxes. At some point, Claire joined her, drawing roads with a pencil and asking about the mayor of the city. Grace answered shyly, glancing between the two of them. "She's different," she whispered later to her father, curled into his side on the couch. Julian kissed her hair. "Different how?" "Not a teacher, not like Mom either." He didn't answer, just held her a little tighter. It wasn't a clean transition. When Julian told Miranda about Claire, it was on one of their tense co-parenting calls, a conversation full of half-finished sentences and loaded silences. "She's Grace's tutor," he admitted. "She's been helping me too, more than she probably should have." Miranda's voice was clipped. "You're dating the help now." "She's not," he bit down hard on the rest. "It's not like that, she's important to both of us." Miranda sighed. "Do whatever you want, Julian, but don't screw Grace up while you're figuring yourself out." He didn't reply. With Claire it stayed slow. She didn't rush into their lives. She visited once or twice a week, never overnight. She never tried to parent, never overstepped. Julian watched her carefulness with quiet awe, how she never filled the silences unless they needed filling, how she gave Grace space to come to her. Sometimes they talked for hours after Grace had gone to sleep, curled up in the corner of the couch, knees touching, lights low. He told her things he hadn't told anyone since college, about how success had made him smaller, not bigger, about the pressure of being everything to everyone and feeling like nothing to himself. Claire told him about a boy she'd loved once in high school who'd broken her trust in a single sentence, about how she'd stopped letting people all the way in after that, how easy it was to be needed but not known. Julian knew the feeling too well. "You know what scares me the most?" he asked her one night, voice hushed in the dark. She looked at him. "What?" "That this could be real, that you're not temporary." Claire leaned in, resting her forehead lightly against his. "Then let's not rush it, let's build it real." The first time Claire stayed late enough to fall asleep on his couch, Julian didn't dare move. She was curled under a blanket, breathing soft and even. Her shoes were kicked off, one arm draped over the cushion, the other tucked under her cheek. Grace had been asleep for hours. Julian sat across from her, a book open but unread in his lap, and watched her like she might disappear if he blinked too long. He didn't know how he'd gone from carefully constructed isolation to this, to wanting someone in his space, in his quiet. But she was here, and nothing in his life had ever felt so still and right. And then the emergency call came. He was in the middle of making dinner, real dinner, not takeout, when Cam called from the office. "There's a leak," she said. "Someone's selling insider information. They're coming for your seat, Julian. This could go public." Just like that, everything tilted. The board was demanding answers. Investors wanted blood. His phone rang constantly. He missed dinner, then breakfast. Claire texted. He didn't answer. Grace asked where he was. He told her he'd be back soon. But soon kept moving further away. Claire showed up 3 days later, standing in his doorway with a bag of groceries and a worried crease in her brow. "Let me help," she said, stepping inside before he could argue. He didn't talk much that night, just stood at the stove while she made pasta, shoulders tight, mouth a line. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly. Julian closed his eyes. "I've always been alone in it." "Not anymore," she said. It was simple, quiet, not a declaration, just a truth. And when he finally broke, voice shaking as he told her about the betrayal in his own company, about the fear of losing everything, she held his hand and didn't flinch. The scandal passed slowly. He found the mole, the board didn't vote him out, but something in Julian had changed. He took Grace out of private school, enrolled her in a smaller, arts-focused one near Claire's neighborhood. He started walking her to school. He left the office at 4 on Fridays. He let go of the version of himself that had once believed being invulnerable was the same as being strong. And one quiet night, months later, he told Claire he loved her. She didn't say it back right away. She just smiled, eyes soft, and kissed him like she'd been waiting for him to believe it first. There was no big proposal, no fireworks. Just a key on a simple ring, handed over at her apartment one rainy night. "I don't want to keep saying goodbye," Julian said. "So if you want to be here, not just for Grace, not just for me, for you." Claire looked at the key, then at him, and nodded. "Yes, just like that. Not perfect, not easy, but real and enough." It was the dishes that brought it all to the surface. Stacked high in the sink, unwashed for a day too long, they reminded Claire of everything she was trying not to feel. The move had gone smoothly, at least on the surface. Her books were lined up on shelves next to Julian's stark finance volumes, her sweaters folded in drawers where starched shirts once lived alone. Grace had even made a hand-drawn "Welcome to our home" sign and taped it to the front of the fridge. But the kitchen was quiet now, the kind of quiet that prickled at her skin. Julian had been buried in a new product launch for weeks. Long hours returned. His phone buzzed well into the night. Grace was adjusting to her new school, but Claire could feel the tremors underneath. Changes were stacking up too fast for a sensitive 8-year-old. She tried to be everything to both of them. The calm, the glue, the one who knew what to say when Julian shut down or Grace acted out. But she wasn't okay, not really. She stood barefoot on the tile floor, fingers clenched around a sponge, water running too hot. Her chest ached, not from anything big or dramatic, just the slow press of being needed in every room and never fully sure where she fit. She hadn't said it yet, the word that had been sitting heavy in her chest for days. Lonely. Even surrounded by them, Julian's soft good mornings, Grace's quiet trust, there were nights Claire lay awake beside him and felt it still. Like she'd stepped into a life too big for her, like she was waiting for someone to realize she didn't belong. Julian saw it before she spoke it. He came home late that Tuesday, coat soaked from the unexpected spring rain, his shoulders tight with tension. Claire was on the couch, reading but not really. She didn't look up when he walked in. That was the first sign. He dropped his bag, hung up his coat, stood behind the couch for a moment, unsure. "How was today?" he asked. Claire closed the book. "Fine." The word fell like a rock between them. "Claire," his voice softened, "talk to me." She exhaled, long and slow. "I don't think I know how right now." That hurt more than he expected. "I know I've been buried in work, I know I've been absent, but this isn't just on me, is it?" he asked carefully. Claire shook her head, eyes glossy. "No, it's not. Sometimes I feel like I walked into a life that already had its shape. I'm trying to make myself fit, but I don't know if I do." Julian moved around the couch, sitting across from her. "You think you don't belong here?" She didn't answer, not directly, just looked at him like she was asking him not to make her explain it again. "I chose you," he said, "not because I needed help with Grace, not because I was broken and you fixed me. I chose you because you see things no one else bothers to look for." Claire's jaw trembled, "But I miss having something that's mine." It wasn't an accusation, just the quiet truth of someone who'd set down her whole life to carry someone else's for a while. He reached across the small table and took her hand. "Then let's build that," he said, "not just my life with you in it, ours together." He meant it. The next morning, Julian took a call from his car instead of the office, waiting outside Grace's school. He cleared his schedule for the weekend. No emergencies, no board reports. He picked up Claire's favorite breakfast on the way home and sat across from her at the table like they were starting something new. "I want to do better," he said, "not just in the big ways, in the boring, everyday ones." Claire looked at him for a long time, then reached over and placed her hand over his. "You're not boring," she said. "You're just scared like the rest of us." They smiled, small and tired, but together. That night they cooked together for the first time in weeks. Grace helped cut vegetables. There was flour on the floor and burnt edges on the lasagna, but the kitchen felt like it had breath again, like it was lived in, not just moved into. They didn't fix everything in one night, but they stopped pretending there was nothing to fix. One afternoon, while Claire was reading in the backyard and Julian was fixing a loose fence board, Grace came outside holding a drawing in both hands. "I made this at school," she said, standing between them. Julian dried his hands and crouched beside her. "Can we see?" She unfolded the paper carefully. It was a family portrait, 3 figures holding hands, Julian on the left, tall with a tie, Grace in the middle, and Claire on the right, smiling with a scarf like the one she always wore in the fall. Underneath, in careful block letters, "My family." Claire stared at it, chest tightening. "Do you mean this?" she asked gently. Grace nodded. "I didn't at first, but I do now." Julian looked up at Claire, eyes quiet, and in that moment she felt the weight lift, not completely, but enough. Enough to believe that maybe she belonged here, not because she was needed, but because she was loved. Later that week, Claire found a room at the back of the house, what had once been a home gym Julian barely used, and turned it into something of her own. She filled it with books, soft lighting, a second-hand desk she'd refinished herself, a room for tutoring again, but also writing, dreaming, something that didn't revolve around anyone else. Julian peeked in on the weekend, coffee in hand. "You okay?" Claire smiled from her desk. "Better." He leaned in the doorway, watching her. "I like seeing you here. When you're in your own space, you glow a little." Claire laughed. "You're biased." "Maybe, but I'm also observant." They didn't rush toward anything. No talk of marriage yet, no big declarations. But one night, while brushing his teeth beside her in the bathroom they now shared, Julian looked at her in the mirror and said, simply, "I'm not afraid anymore." Claire turned, toothbrush still in hand, and raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Of letting someone stay." And she smiled because she wasn't afraid either. "Not anymore." Spring deepened slowly, in the way that New York sometimes allows. Soft rains that washed the grit off sidewalks, yellow buds opening along wrought iron fences, street vendors trading in roasted chestnuts for bright tulips and soft pretzels. Inside their shared brownstone, the rhythm of life had settled into something quiet and steady. Claire's scarf hung next to Julian's jacket. Grace's drawings rotated weekly on the fridge. Their routines were small but deliberate: morning pancakes on Saturdays, library trips on Thursdays, and silent tea after Grace's bedtime on the nights neither of them had the words for how tired they were. There was no need to name everything anymore. Whatever they were, it was something steady, something chosen. Still, change came knocking in its own way. One late afternoon, Claire got a message from a public charter school a few blocks from their home, an offer to head up a new literacy program. Not just tutoring, but designing something lasting, something hers. She'd applied on a whim weeks ago, hadn't even told Julian. She read the email 3 times before breathing. Julian was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, helping Grace make sandwiches for a school project on foods from around the world. Peanut butter smeared on the counter, laughter bubbling between them. Claire leaned against the doorway, phone clutched in her hand, heart pulling in 2 directions. She could say no, keep the pace they had, keep the quiet. But she didn't want quiet anymore. Not only quiet, she wanted to grow again, be more than who she was when she stepped into this house. Julian glanced up. Something in her expression must have said enough. "What is it?" he asked, setting the butter knife down. "I got offered a program, a big one." She stepped forward, voice catching somewhere between thrill and fear. "They want me to build a whole curriculum, hire a team, it's full-time." Julian wiped his hands on a towel and walked toward her, Grace peeking up from behind the counter. He didn't hesitate. You should take it. Claire blinked, you're sure? Claire, he reached for her hand. You've spent so long holding the rest of us up, it's your turn. Grace came over, wrapping her arms around Claire's waist. Will you still be here after school? Claire smiled, brushing hair from Grace's forehead. Every day I can, and if I'm not, you'll know where I am. It was enough, it was everything. They celebrated with pizza on the rooftop, the three of them wrapped in blankets as the sun dipped below the skyline. Claire wore one of Julian's hoodies, and Grace fell asleep before the second slice. Julian looked over the city as lights flickered on. I used to think life was about building something no one could touch, he said, but maybe it's about building something people can grow inside of. Claire leaned against him, head on his shoulder. That's what love is. It doesn't trap you, it lets you become more. He turned toward her slowly. I didn't know how to love like that before you. She met his eyes. You do now. In the months that followed, their lives didn't become simpler. There were tired mornings, missed alarms, one tense week when Grace caught the flu and Claire had a grant deadline looming. But nothing fractured. They learned to take turns. Julian kept a drawer at work stocked with art supplies for the afternoons Grace stopped by. Claire built her program brick by brick and still found time to meet Julian at a tiny cafe on the corner on Fridays, something they called Us Hour, even if it was only 40 minutes and lukewarm coffee. They found joy in small things, a sticky note Claire left on Julian's steering wheel, Grace's first school play, the way Julian remembered to keep the porch light on when Claire worked late. One night months later, as summer began to press warm palms against the city, they sat out on that same rooftop. Grace was asleep below. The world buzzed quietly around them. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. Not a ring, just a ribbon. He held it out to her. What's this? Claire asked. He looked at her steady. It's from the first book you brought to tutor Grace. She kept it, said it was your magic bookmark. Claire laughed soft. I forgot about that. Julian ran his thumb over the frayed edges. I was going to do some big thing, a speech, a ring eventually, but I think this is where it starts. He placed the ribbon in her palm, closed her fingers over it. I want to spend my life building quiet things with you. Small, good things that last. No more performances, just this, just us. Claire's eyes filled, and she didn't try to blink it away. Okay, she said, then let's keep choosing this. He pulled her in, kissed her slow and certain, and the world tilted just enough to feel new again. Later, when Claire climbed into bed, Grace stirred and asked, Is everything okay? Claire tucked the blanket over her and whispered, Better than okay. Grace nodded, already halfway asleep. And in the dark, Julian reached for Claire's hand across the sheets. No words this time. Just the warmth of fingers brushing together. And the quiet truth of a life no longer waiting to begin.